The first thing she noticed about him was the scar. It ran from the left corner of his jaw down beneath the collar of his dress uniform, a pale ridge of tissue that caught the chandelier light of the V3 reception hall and turned it silver. The second thing she noticed was that he was not looking at her. Every other human in the room had been looking at her since the doors opened, the way their eyes tracked her movement, the way their conversation stuttered when she walked past. This one was studying the canapes. Princess Valith on Sarath, third daughter of the governing star of the V3 Compact, third in succession to the administrative authority over 11 settled systems, stood in the center of the hall and considered the back of his head. "Who is that?" she asked her attaché Dreshal. Dreshal's secondary eyes tracked the direction of her gaze. His primary eyes remained professionally forward. "That is Corporal Marcus Kane, your Radiance. He has been assigned as part of the diplomatic escort." "A corporal." She said the word with the emphasis her people reserved for small, mildly interesting things. A peculiar insect, an unusual mineral formation. "They sent a corporal." "They sent an admiral and 3 generals as well, your Radiance. The corporal is—" Dreshal paused in the particular way that meant he was choosing his words carefully. "An attachment." "An attachment," she turned the word over. "What does that mean?" "I believe it means that when the admiral was asked if he wanted the corporal present, he said yes immediately and did not explain why." Valith's interest sharpened slightly. She crossed the hall with the unhurried drift of someone who owned every room she entered, her retinue flowing behind her like the hem of a gown. The human escort guards saw her coming, and their postures adjusted almost imperceptibly, that small human tension that meant awareness without action. It was an interesting species, she had concluded after 2 years of diplomatic engagement, deeply readable once you learned the tells. Their faces communicated so much, so involuntarily. The guards were nervous. The generals, speaking in a cluster near the tall windows, were pleased with themselves. The admiral, she noted, was watching her approach the corporal with an expression she could not quite classify. The corporal was still reading the label on a small container of something pale and gelatinous. "Human," she said. He turned. His face was unremarkable in the way that all human faces were unremarkable to her, bilaterally symmetrical, forward-facing eyes, expressions concentrated in a small central zone. What was not unremarkable was the extent of the scarring. His left ear was partially reconstructed. There was a depth to the socket of his left eye that suggested the eye itself was not original equipment. His hands, she noticed when he set down the container, had the texture of repeatedly damaged and repaired tissue across the knuckles and along the outer edge of the right palm. He was looking at her with an expression she had learned to identify as polite attention, nothing more. "You are the corporal," she said. "Yes, your Radiance." "And your rank is corporal." She let her gaze move across him with the frankness that was normal among the V3, not rudeness, just thoroughness. "This is your highest rank." "It is my current rank, your Radiance." "You have held higher ranks." Something moved through his expression, very briefly. "At various points, yes." "And you were demoted." "Separated from service, then reinstated." "Several times." He said this without any particular inflection, the way one might describe a series of unremarkable weather events. Valith tilted her head. "You were separated from service, and then they brought you back." "Yes." "Why would they bring you back if they had separated you?" He considered this. "I think they decided the situations I was useful for outweighed the situations I was inconvenient for." A sound moved through her retinue. Not quite laughter. The V3 equivalent was a sharp exhalation through the upper respiratory vents, a sort of percussive amusement. Several of her courtiers produced it now. The humans nearest to them heard it, and their expressions shifted in ways she had learned meant discomfort on behalf of a third party. Valith looked at the corporal, who was still looking at her with that same polite attention. You are telling me, she said, that your own military found you inconvenient. Several times, yes. And yet they did not simply release you from service permanently. They tried that too. The exhalations again, louder. Valith herself allowed the curve of her secondary lips to express amusement, which among the V3 was a public gesture, a sharing of the joke. So you are, she said, a soldier whom your own people cannot be rid of. That's one way to put it. And they have brought you here, to a reception attended by admirals and generals, in the rank of corporal, too, she gestured at the canapé table behind him, to study the refreshments. I was reading the allergen information, force of habit. The laughter properly now, even the human word for the sound seemed right. She heard the generals behind her exchange quiet words. The admiral remained silent. Corporal Kane, she said, settling into the performance of someone giving a gift to someone who would not fully appreciate it. I hope you enjoy the reception. I'm sure I will, Your Radiance. Your people set a good table. She moved on. Behind her, she heard one of her junior courtiers whisper something to another, and the response, a corporal. They brought a corporal who cannot manage to stay employed. More exhalations. She did not look back at him. Across the room, Admiral Ewan watched the princess move away from Marcus Kane, and then looked at Kane, and then looked at the floor, and then at the ceiling, and then made the face he always made when something was happening that he could not stop. The war, they called it a border disagreement in the official dispatches, because the word war carried obligations that neither side wanted yet, began 6 weeks later over a transit corridor that the V3 Compact had decided, in the reorganization of their administrative zones, now fell within their sovereign navigation territory. The corridor contained 2 human colony transports mid-route. The transports were boarded. No one was killed in the boarding, which the Compact's communique cited as evidence of their restraint. The humans aboard the transports, approximately 4,400 people including 800 children from the new Meridian settlement, were held pending resolution of the transit dispute. The resolution took 3 days to fail. The diplomatic mission ended when the V3 senior representative informed Admiral Ewan that the Compact's patience with human presumption regarding stellar territory had concluded. Ewan, who had been in diplomacy long enough to hear what was not being said, asked a single question before the channel closed. He asked where Marcus Kane was. Kane was in the corridor outside the briefing room, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, eating a food bar. He was doing this because the briefing room had not yet been opened, and he had gotten there early, which was something he did. Ewan came out of the communications center and found him there, and sat down next to him on the floor, which his knees objected to, and his dignity had long since stopped caring about. They're moving on New Meridian, Ewan said. I know. How do you know? The transit dispute was never about the corridor. Kane broke off a piece of the bar and offered it. Ewan shook his head. It was about establishing precedent for sovereign territory in that sector. You do that, the navigation routes to the Meridian cluster become V3 space. You can't resupply the colonies there without V3 permission. The colonies either come to the Compact or they starve. So the transports were the opening move. Ewan was quiet for a moment. The princess is going to be in the sector. She's on her ceremonial inspection tour. I know that too. She's going to be on V3 Command Station Orifel when we make whatever we're going to make. I assumed. Ewan looked at him sideways. In the 10 years he had known Marcus Kane, he had developed a practiced taxonomy of the man's silences. This one was the kind where Kane had already thought through the situation several moves further than anyone else in the conversation, and was waiting with the patience of someone who had learned, over a long time, that people needed to arrive at conclusions on their own schedule. I need you in the field, Ewan said. I know. Are you going to give me the speech about how you're technically still on disciplinary review? No. Good, Ewan's knees protested as he stood. Because I was just going to ignore it. Kane finished the food bar and folded the wrapper into a precise small square and put it in his pocket. It was the kind of small detail that, if you knew what to look for, told you something about a person. Ewan had stopped trying to explain what it told him, because the people he tried to explain it to always looked at him like he was being sentimental. New Meridian Colony sat in a temperate basin on a planet with a green-tinted sky, surrounded by native forest that had been partially cleared for agriculture, and had been partially reclaiming the cleared sections for the past 40 years in the gentle, persistent way that living things had of returning to space given time. The colony itself was structured the way most of the mid-generation colonies were. A central processing hub, residential clusters spread out in a rough spiral, and the kinds of improvised infrastructure decisions that happened when the people building something were more focused on survival than planning. It was a good place for children to grow up. There was a creek. There were trees that had turned out to be climbable. The gravity was slightly lighter than Earth standard, which meant that children who grew up there were taller on average and could jump a little higher than anyone expected when they visited the core worlds. The V3 assault force that arrived in the pre-dawn hours of the third day, of what the Compact was calling the Meridian Administrative Integration, came in 3 atmosphere-capable carriers supported by 2 frigate-class vessels holding position above the cloud layer. They came in without warning because the colony's long-range detection array had been quietly neutralized via the sabotage of a navigation relay buoy 4 days earlier, a move that had seemed like a minor routing error until it was not. They were not expecting to encounter resistance. They found it anyway. The first carrier's forward assault team hit the eastern residential cluster and immediately found that the path through had been collapsed. Not damaged, collapsed, deliberately, in a way that funneled their approach through a choke point formed by 2 grain storage structures. The second team, moving on the central hub, discovered that the processing center had been emptied, and the infrastructure there rerouted in a way that caused their communications to cascade through a feedback pattern that would have taken their signals people several minutes to untangle. The third team, coming in low from the south over the reclaimed forest, encountered something they did not have a word for immediately. What they had was the experience of moving through trees, and then suddenly not moving because the team lead had stopped and raised a fist in the signal that meant stop, and their training had stopped them before their reasoning caught up. Standing in the tree line, 30 meters ahead, was a human. He was wearing the mottled field gear of the Terran Colonial Defense Force, which the V3 combat teams had been briefed on, and he was standing in a posture that the V3 assault team's behavioral analyst would later describe as entirely comfortable, which was not a phrase that appeared frequently in combat after-action reports. He did not have a weapon raised. He had his hands in his jacket pockets. The team lead, whose name was Fithrak Sunthais, and who had 17 years of service in the Compact's Enforcement Division, looked at this human for approximately 3 seconds, and then looked at the trees around him, and then looked back at the human. "You are trespassing in V3 administrative territory," Fithrak Sunthais said, because it was protocol and also because he needed a moment to think. "This colony has been designated for integration under Compact authority." "There's a pressure mine 12 centimeters to your left," the human said. "Don't move that foot." Fithrak Sunthais did not move that foot. He was not a coward. He had been in combat. He understood what was happening, intellectually. This was a delaying action by a single soldier against a 30-member assault team, and the mine claim might be genuine or it might be a bluff, and either way the outcome was not going to be a negotiation. What he could not account for, and what he would spend a long time afterward trying to account for, was the specific quality of the silence that followed. The human was not performing confidence. He was not hiding fear. He was simply standing there with the particular stillness of someone who had run out of the capacity to be surprised by any development in any situation. A stillness that came not from calm, but from a kind of thorough exhaustion of every possible response to the universe, all of which had been used up and discarded, leaving only function. "My name is Sunthais," he said, because the protocols also covered this. "What is your name?" "Cain," the human said. Sunthais would learn much later that the mind claim was not a bluff. The evacuation of New Meridian's essential population, children, medical cases, and the elderly, was completed in the 4 hours and 23 minutes between Cain's engagement of the Southern Assault Team and the eventual establishment of V3 perimeter control over the colony. It was completed into a set of pre-designated shelter positions in the deeper forest that the V3 thermal scanning equipment had trouble reading through the local canopy's particular chemical composition, which Cain had noted in his initial site assessment, and which his preliminary report had described as a surveillance limitation worth considering for contingency planning. The admiral who had initially dismissed that report as overly cautious for what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic posting had since tendered a private apology, which Cain had accepted without particular ceremony. 41 civilians were not evacuated in time. They were taken by the V3 forces and transported to Command Station Orifal, the same station where Princess Valith was conducting her ceremonial inspection. She was informed of the civilians' presence and recommended that they be treated well, because she understood, or thought she understood, that their treatment would be a point of leverage in the negotiations that would inevitably follow. She did not yet know that among the people who had not been evacuated in time was an engineer named Yusra Obi, who had stayed behind because she had refused to leave while the colony's water filtration system was still running and at risk of V3 interference, and who had been arrested while manually disabling the system's connection to the colony infrastructure in a way that would make it very difficult to reconnect. She also did not know that Yusra Obi had a brother. Command Station Orifal was a V3 administrative hub of the kind that the Compact built during periods of territorial expansion, large enough to demonstrate permanence, equipped with the full apparatus of governance, situated at a navigational nexus that made it easy to supply and difficult to approach unnoticed. Its defensive systems were considered state-of-the-art. Its sensor array was comprehensive. Its garrison was 840 soldiers, 2 destroyer-class vessels, and a defense platform with what the Compact's technical divisions called area denial capability. Cain arrived on Orifal 11 days after the fall of New Meridian, which was faster than the V3 Intelligence Division's most aggressive timeline for any possible Terran response, because the most aggressive timeline had been calculated assuming standard military logistics. Cain was not operating under standard military logistics. He was operating under a set of conditions that Ewan had described in the authorization order as whatever the hell he decides is necessary, which was not formal military language, but which everyone who saw the order understood immediately. He arrived in a cargo container. The cargo container was part of a supply shipment from a V3 commercial provisioner that supplied non-military goods to the station's administrative population, foodstuffs, personal items, maintenance supplies. The container had been intercepted and repackaged in a process that had required the cooperation of 3 different people in 3 different locations, and had been completed in a way that left no trace in the supply chain that was not, individually, explicable by something mundane. The intelligence operation that had made this possible had been running for 4 years. It had been authorized by a deputy subdirector of colonial affairs, who had approved a budget line item described as Regional Supply Chain Resilience Mapping. Cain spent 18 hours in the container before it was offloaded to the station's supply bay. Then he spent 6 more hours in the supply bay, waiting for the shift change, because he had calculated that the shift change represented a 20-minute window where the bay's security protocols were in technical overlap. He did not sleep during this time. He rarely slept in situations where the cost of sleeping was measured in outcomes rather than discomfort. He had learned over the years that the human body was more resilient than most people gave it credit for, and that most people gave it credit for less than they should because they had not yet found out what it could sustain. He had found out. The finding out had started when he was 19, deployed on his first colonial defense posting, when the settlement his unit was protecting was hit by a raid from a species called the Voreth that the diplomatic corps had been in the middle of promising would not happen. Kane had been hit by debris from a collapsing structure. His left leg had been compromised. His communications unit had been destroyed. He had spent 31 hours in a rubble pocket before the extraction team found him. The leg had been rebuilt. It was not entirely biological. You could not tell by looking. The next time he had found out was on a station called Arkin's Point, where an unexpected structural failure during an engagement had resulted in a situation that the medical after-action report described as survivable with intervention, and that Kane, who had been conscious for parts of it, described privately as an education. His left eye was not entirely biological either. The third time, and the fourth, and the fifth, these had been in the years that the Terran Colonial Defense Force did not discuss in their official histories, the years when the second wave of extrasolar colonization had encountered species that were not initially understood, and the encounters had not gone smoothly. Kane had been part of the units tasked with establishing safe corridors. The methods they had used were now, in the diplomatic era, sensitive subjects. He had been injured. He had been rebuilt. He had learned each time something additional about what the human organism could endure and about what it could become. The military had separated him from service twice during those years. Once because of a decision he had made that his commanding officer found excessive. Once because of a decision his commanding officer had made that Kane had found unacceptable and had said so in terms that resulted in a court-martial. Both times they had brought him back, not because they liked him, though some of them did. Because the situations that required someone who had survived the things Kane had survived were not hypothetical, they were recurring, and the list of people who met the requirements was short. He found Yusra Obi in a holding facility on the station's second residential tier, in a room with 7 other civilians from New Meridian. She was sitting with her back against the wall and her arms around a 14-year-old boy who was asleep against her shoulder. The guards were V3 soldiers who were doing their jobs with a professionalism that reflected the princess's instruction to treat the prisoners well. Kane identified himself in a whisper. Yusra looked at him for a long moment, processing, and then produced an expression he had seen many times, which meant, "I knew someone was coming, but I did not know it would be this fast." "Marcus," she said, which was not his name but which was close enough. "It's Marcus," he confirmed, because this was not the moment for pedantry. "The kids," she said immediately, "there are 4 children." "I know." He had already counted them through the security feed. "They go first. Everyone walks, nobody runs until I say run." Getting out was slower than getting in, because getting out required 8 people instead of 1, including 4 children of various ages and a 73-year-old man with a respiratory condition that meant he breathed audibly. Kane had accounted for this. He had built extra time into the extraction window. He had made contingency decisions about which corridors to avoid and which to use, and in what sequence, a spatial calculation of the kind that he had made so many times in so many different structures that the process was no longer conscious, just present. They were 4 corridors from the docking bay when the alarm went off. It was not triggered by them. Valeth's personal security detail had, in the routine sweep they conducted twice per shift, found the anomaly in the supply bay that Kane had left when he exited the container. A thorough security detail, working efficiently. He would have done the same. "Run," he said. Princess Valeth was informed of the security breach while she was reviewing administrative reports in her quarters. She was also informed, 8 minutes later, that the breach appeared to involve the civilian holding facility. She was on her way to the Security Operations Center when the alert came that a vessel had undocked from the secondary bay. A small cargo-class shuttle that had been attached to the supply delivery, whose departure clearance codes turned out on review to have been issued by a cargo manifest processor that had itself been accessed via a credential set that had been issued 6 months ago to a provisioning contractor. She stood in the middle of the operations center and looked at the display that showed the shuttle moving away from the station at a speed that its class should not have been able to sustain. And she felt, for the first time in the Meridian matter, something that was not administrative confidence. "How many did they take?" she asked. "All 41 civilians, Your Radiance." She looked at the display for another moment. The security team that was guarding the facility. "Sedated, Your Radiance, non-lethally." She breathed. The non-lethal element mattered, not tactically but as information. "Send intercept, don't destroy the vessel." Her second, General Verhanas, looked at her. "Your Radiance." "I said don't destroy it. We need the person who planned this." They caught the shuttle 40 minutes later, which was what Kane had expected. The intercept window had been built into the plan because the plan was not actually about the shuttle. The shuttle was a container, in the way that the cargo container had been a container. What mattered was what was in it and what it would provoke. He was standing in the shuttle's small forward space when the V3 docking clamps engaged. He had made sure that the civilians were secured, and that the children understood that what was about to happen was not danger, which was not entirely accurate but was true enough for the specific definition of danger that children understood. The boarding party came in prepared for resistance. They found him sitting on a crate. He was, again, not doing anything threatening. He was looking at his hands, specifically at the texture of the skin on his right palm, the way he sometimes did when he was thinking. The boarding team's leader, not Feethrak, Sunthighs this time, a different soldier, said, "Human, you are under arrest by authority of the V3 Compact." "I know," Kane said, "that's why I'm here." They brought him to Valeth. This was not standard procedure. Standard procedure would have placed him in a secure holding facility pending interrogation by intelligence personnel. But Valeth had given specific orders, and her specific orders were that she wanted to see the person who had come aboard her station in a cargo container and removed 41 prisoners in under 3 hours, because she wanted to understand what she was dealing with. He was escorted into a room that was not a throne room but functioned as one, the kind of space that power assembled without necessarily meaning to, where the furniture and the light and the arrangement of the walls all communicated hierarchy. She was standing when he came in. She had considered sitting, because sitting was the more powerful posture among the V3, conveying that you were at ease while the other person was not. She had decided to stand because she found that she wanted to be fully present in this encounter, and full presence for her meant being upright. He was brought in restraints, hands secured in front of him. He looked around the room in the methodical way she had noticed at the reception, assessing, cataloging, not performing anything. Then he looked at her. "Corporal Kane," she said. "Your Radiance. You came to my station in a cargo container." "I did." "And removed 41 prisoners. 41 civilians." She noted the correction, 41 civilians. "Without injuring any of my personnel." "Yes." "Why?" He considered this with what she was coming to recognize as genuine consideration, not the pause of someone deciding what to say, but of someone deciding which true thing to say. Several reasons. Injuring your personnel would have made extraction harder, not easier. It would have triggered a faster response. And I had no reason to injure them. They were doing their jobs. They were imprisoning civilians. They were following orders regarding people they had been told were being held pending resolution of a territorial dispute. That's different from choosing to hurt someone. Valeth looked at him for a moment. Among the V3, the ability to make these distinctions was considered a mark of a certain kind of mind, precise, disciplined, not given to the emotional inflation of situations. She had not expected it in this particular human, in this particular context. "You were at the reception," she said, 6 weeks ago. "Yes. I mocked you." He looked at her steadily. "You did. You did not react. There was nothing to react to. You were making an accurate observation with incomplete information." The incomplete information being. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How many realms have you destroyed your radiance?" The question was asked with perfect neutrality, which made it stranger, not less strange. "I have not destroyed any realms," she said. "No," he nodded slightly as if this confirmed something. "I have, or been part of destroying, or been part of a chain of events that resulted in. The Voreth hegemony no longer controls the Kepler transit systems. The Sith Collective's military governance was dissolved after a campaign I was involved in. The Orth Confederation, the territorial Orth Confederation, not the successor states, doesn't exist anymore." He said all of this in the same tone he might have used to describe weather. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you because you asked, essentially, what the incomplete information was." General Verhanas had been standing at the side of the room. He had been in the Compact's military for 32 years. He said, very quietly, "The Orth campaign was classified above my access level." "Most of them are," Kane said, not looking at him. Valeth was looking at the corporal. She was looking at the scars and the reconstructed ear and the depth of the eye socket that meant the eye had been replaced. She was thinking about the reception hall and her courtier's laughter and the way the Admiral had watched her walk away from this man with an expression she had not been able to classify. She classified it now. It had been the expression of someone watching a person unknowingly step close to a cliff edge in the dark, aware that telling them would be more complicated than they could manage in that moment. "You let yourself be captured," she said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because the shuttle was never the actual exfiltration. The shuttle was a signal." He paused. "What did the shuttle's departure achieve from your perspective?" She thought about it. It pulled attention and response assets toward the secondary docking bay and the departure trajectory. And away from. She was quiet. She looked at Verhanas. He was already moving to a communications panel. Kane said, still quietly, "There are 3 other people currently on the station. They are not doing anything harmful. They are documenting. Everything they have documented has already been transmitted. I came here to take the civilians out. They came here to take information out. My capture was part of the plan because it meant you would be focused on me while they finished." "What information?" Verhanas said, his voice tight. "The supply chain anomalies in the Meridian sector's provisioning contracts. The navigation records that show the corridor dispute was manufactured. The communications records between your administrative division and the Compact Council regarding the timing of the transit interdiction." He said all of this quietly, watching Valeth's face. "Not to use against you as blackmail. To file with the Interstellar Arbitration Assembly. You're not a criminal, you're Radiance. You're a politician who made a bad strategic decision based on an intelligence assessment that told you humanity was containable. We want the arbitration process. Not a war." The room was very still. What happened next took 6 days and involved more people than this story can hold, and most of it was not in any room that contained Marcus Kane, because Marcus Kane had fulfilled his specific function and was now, technically, a prisoner, which was a status that came with certain institutional awkwardnesses. Valith released him on the third day, over the objections of her legal counsel, because she had determined that holding him was a liability in the arbitration proceedings, and also because she found, on the third day, that she wanted to ask him something. She found him in the station's secondary observation lounge, which had a view of the star Tau Ceti's light reflected on the upper atmospheric layer of a nearby gas giant, turning the clouds a particular shade of amber. He was sitting with a cup of something hot and looking at it. "How many times?" she asked. She did not specify what she was asking. He understood. 11, he said. 11 times you have been. She searched for the word. Rebuilt, he said, killed if you want to use the word the medical reports use, and then rebuilt. He looked at the cup. The first time I was 19, a building fell on me. I was in a rubble pocket for 31 hours. After they dug me out, they rebuilt the leg, then the eye, then other things. He was quiet. Each time there is less of the original material and more of the rebuilt material. I don't know at what point the rebuilt version is still the same person as the one who went in. I've stopped trying to calculate it. Valith sat down across from him. This was not a calculated gesture. She sat down because she was tired, and because the view of the amber clouds was, in its way, very beautiful, and because she was in the presence of something she did not have a full category for yet. "You said," she said, "that my intelligence assessment told me humanity was containable." It probably did. It did. She folded her hands on the table. It described humanity as a species with significant technological potential but limited strategic endurance, unable to sustain protracted campaigns, prone to internal division under pressure, historically effective in the short term, historically ineffective in the long term. "That assessment is accurate for some humans in some contexts," Kane said. "It's not accurate as a general statement." "What is the accurate general statement?" He looked at the amber clouds for a while. "The accurate general statement," he said finally, "is that every species that has decided humanity was containable has subsequently spent a significant amount of time and resources revising that assessment." He turned the cup in his hands. "Not because we're stronger, not because we're smarter, because we have a specific and frankly unreasonable relationship with being defeated. Most species, when they encounter something that kills them, develop a healthy respect for it. Avoidance behavior, threat assessment that says, that thing kills us, we don't go near it. And humans. Humans look at the thing that killed them and try to understand why it killed them so they can figure out how to make it not kill them the next time. And the time after that. And the time after that. And the time after that. He glanced at the reconstructed ear, 11 times. Valith looked at him for a long time. She thought about her courtier's laughter in the reception hall. She thought about the corporal at the canapé table, reading allergen labels. She thought about the admiral's face. "I owe you an apology," she said. "No," he shook his head. "You made an observation with incomplete information. That's not something to apologize for. That's just a starting point." "A starting point for what?" "For updating the assessment." The Interstellar Arbitration Assembly ruled in favor of the Terran Colonial Defense Forces, complaint 14 weeks later. The V3 Compact agreed to release the navigation corridor and to reopen the resupply routes to the Meridian Cluster. The 41 civilians who had been held on Command Station Orifel had been home for 3 months by then. Yusra Obi had rebuilt the water filtration connection that she had disabled during her arrest, which took her 45 minutes and involved 3 tools and the specific satisfaction of someone completing a task that had been interrupted by circumstance beyond her control. The settlement also included a framework for future territorial disputes that neither side particularly loved, which Admiral Ewan told Kane privately was how you knew it was a real agreement. Kane was at the signing ceremony as part of the diplomatic escort. His rank was still corporal. Someone in the chain of command had tried, twice during the Orifal operation, to issue a field promotion, and he had filed paperwork declining both times on the grounds that his current rank was sufficient for the work being assigned to him. Valith saw him across the room at the signing ceremony and walked toward him, which caused her attaché Dreshal to update his mental taxonomy of situations that were happening. "Corporal Kane," she said. "Your Radiance." She looked at him. He looked back. Around them the ceremony proceeded, pens to documents, formal statements, the efficient language of concluding something. "I have a question," she said. "All right." "The allergen information," she said. "At the reception, were you actually reading it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then there was a compound in the third item in the selection that interacts poorly with a medication that one of the naval personnel on the escort had been recently prescribed. I was noting it to tell her." "That's why you were at the table." "Yes. Not the canapes. I don't eat at diplomatic receptions. Too complicated." Valith was quiet for a moment. She thought about 11 times rebuilt. She thought about the things he had said about humans and defeat. She thought about what it meant that the person standing in front of her, battered, quiet, still reading labels at diplomatic receptions, had walked into her station in a cargo container and walked out with 41 people, without a single death on either side, because he had calculated that a peaceful outcome was achievable and had organized the entire operation around achieving it. "May I ask," she said, "what you think of the settlement?" "It's a starting point," he said. She waited. "The compact's expansion needs resources," he said. "So do the colonies. The navigation corridor dispute isn't going to be the last one. What happens next depends on whether both sides decide the arbitration framework is a tool they want to use or a humiliation they want to reverse." He looked at her. "Which way do you think it goes?" She considered. "I think," she said, "that depends significantly on who in the Compact's council wins the argument about what the past 14 weeks actually meant." "What are the arguments?" "One argument says we encountered a situation we underestimated and lost a minor advantage as a result. The other argument says we encountered something we fundamentally misunderstood, and we should revise our understanding before attempting something similar." "Which argument are you going to make?" She looked at him for a moment, the second one clearly. Something moved through his expression. Very briefly. She had been watching his face more carefully since the conversation in the observation lounge, and she was getting better at reading it. What she saw was approval, the understated kind, the kind that came not from being impressed but from recognizing accuracy. "Good," he said. "Is there anything else you think I should know?" she asked, "for the argument I'm going to make." He thought about it. "Tell them about the allergen information," he said. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because it's the kind of thing that's easy to dismiss as trivial. And the mistake the Compact's intelligence assessment made was dismissing things as trivial that weren't." She understood. The point was not the allergen information. The point was the attention, the particular kind of human attention that read labels at diplomatic receptions, not out of nervousness or eccentricity, but out of the persistent, low-level care for people around them that did not switch off when the situation was formal, when the stakes were political, when the work was done. The kind of attention that had also, in the same human, calculated the visual coverage limitations of a surveillance system using canopy chemistry, and built a 4-hour evacuation window out of grain silos and a pre-planned choke point. That was the thing that was easy to dismiss, and the thing that was a mistake to dismiss. "I will tell them," she said. Across the room, Admiral Ewan was watching this conversation with the expression of a man who had long since stopped being surprised, and had settled into something that was closer to the quiet satisfaction of a person watching something unfold the way it was always going to unfold. Eventually, once enough information was in the hands of enough people with the clarity to use it. He watched the princess walk back toward the signing table, and he watched Kane turn back to the window view of the nearby stars' reflected light, and he thought about cargo containers and 11 rebuildings, and a food bar wrapper folded into a precise small square, and he decided, not for the first time, that the word humanity covered a lot of different things, and that the things it covered were, on the whole, worth the trouble. Marcus Kane stood at the window and watched the light from a distant sun play across the architectural lines of the V3 station, and he thought about the water filtration system that Yusra Obi had fixed in 45 minutes, and about the 4 children who had been old enough to follow instructions and young enough to be carried, and about the creek at New Meridian where the gravity was slightly lighter than Earth standard, and kids could jump higher than expected. He thought, we're still here. He thought, we keep being still here. He put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the light on the walls. He was ready for what was next. There is a particular kind of intelligence briefing that no one in the upper tiers of Terran Colonial Command liked to give, because it required acknowledging things that made the people receiving it uncomfortable, and the people receiving it were not people who were accustomed to discomfort. The briefing was called, internally, a pattern assessment. It had no formal designation because formalizing it would have required acknowledging that a pattern existed, and acknowledging the pattern existed would have required explaining how they knew, and explaining how they knew would have required explaining what had been done in the years that were not in the official histories. The pattern assessment, stripped of its institutional hesitancy, said the following. Since the beginning of extrasolar colonization, humanity had encountered 18 species capable of interstellar travel or activity. Of those 18, 6 had initially assessed humanity as a minor or containable threat and had subsequently revised that assessment. Of those 6, 4 had revised it in response to a specific event or series of events involving a particular subset of Terran personnel. The subset was not large. The pattern was consistent. The briefing noted, in careful language, that this subset appeared to share certain characteristics that were difficult to quantify, but that recurred with enough consistency that they had been given an informal designation within the intelligence community. The designation was Meridian Class. It was named after an earlier incident, not the New Meridian colony, a different meridian, a navigational beacon station that no longer existed, where the incident that had generated the first pattern assessment had taken place. Kane had been involved in that one too, which was not the reason the designation was named Meridian. It was named Meridian because the station had been at a place called Meridian Point, and the name had stuck the way informal designations did, by being used twice and then assumed. Kane was aware of the designation. He found it unnecessary. When he had said this to Yuan, Yuan had told him that the designation was not for Kane's benefit. It was for the benefit of the people who needed a category to put in their briefing documents, and Kane had accepted this because it was accurate. What the designation meant in practice was that when an alien diplomatic delegation was hosting a reception, and the Terran response was to include a Meridian-class attachment in the escort, the people who knew what the designation meant understood what was actually being communicated. It was not, we are bringing our best soldier. It was, we are bringing someone who has survived things that were not supposed to be survivable and has, in the process, developed a set of capabilities that cannot be fully described in a personnel file. Be aware. Admiral Yuan had made sure Valith's intelligence attaché received the designation code in the pre-reception briefing materials. The attaché had flagged it. The flag had not made it to the princess before the reception, because the attaché had forwarded it through a standard intelligence review channel, and the channel had a processing backlog, and bureaucratic timing had its own sense of humor. Dreshal, the personal attaché, had not received the flag. He had received the basic personnel file. The basic personnel file listed rank, service record summary, and assignments, and the assignments were listed in the declassified form, which described them as regional stability operations and colonial infrastructure support, and similar phrases that meant specific things to people with the clearance to read what they meant. Valith had not read the file. She had assumed the Admiral's insistence on Kane's presence was a minor piece of face-saving by a military man who wanted to feel he had some professional input into the escort composition. She had assumed a corporal was a corporal. She was not the first to make this assumption. She would not be the last. The V3 Compacts Council met in emergency session 12 days after the arbitration ruling. The session was formally about implementation, the specific mechanisms by which the corridor would be restored, the schedule for releasing navigation rights, the framework documentation that had to be translated into compact administrative format. But the actual subject of the session, the one that took 7 hours and produced a vote that was closer than anyone in the council had expected, was the question of what the past 3 months meant. Valith presented the second argument. She had prepared for 4 days. She had spoken to Verhanas, who had 32 years of service in the Compact's military, and who had been in the room when Kane had described the Vorath hegemony and the Sith collective, and the Orath Confederation in the tone of someone listing completed administrative tasks. She had spoken to Fithraxunthais, who had been the team lead in the New Meridian Forest and who had written, in his formal after-action report, the phrase, encountered a Terran ground operative whose posture and behavioral presentation were inconsistent with standard tactical threat profiles, and who had said to her in person, more simply, I have been in combat for 17 years and I knew, before he said anything, that the situation was not what it appeared to be. I could not have told you how I knew. She had also, in the preparation for the council session, requested and received, after a certain amount of intergovernmental friction, a summary of Kane's declassified service record. She read it carefully. She read the phrases like regional stability operations and colonial infrastructure support, and she looked at the dates and the locations, and she did the calculation that anyone with a good regional map and a knowledge of which human-alien engagements had occurred where and when could do, and she arrived at an understanding of what those phrases meant that was different from what they said. She presented the second argument to the council. She said, the intelligence assessment that informed the Meridian decision was built on accurate data that led to an inaccurate conclusion. The data correctly identified humanity's internal political tensions, correctly identified technological limitations in specific domains, correctly identified the history of short-term human colonial overreach. The conclusion that these factors made humanity containable failed because it measured the wrong variables. She said, the corridor dispute was a test. We tested a threshold and found that the threshold was different from where we expected it to be. This is information. The question before this council is whether we treat it as an embarrassment or as an education. The first argument said, an embarrassment, minimize it, recalibrate, try again more carefully. The second argument said, an education, and the lesson is not tactical. The lesson is about the nature of the species we are dealing with, and the nature requires us to revise not just our strategy but our framework for understanding what the strategy is trying to achieve. She talked about the allergen information. She talked about it carefully, knowing that it would sound trivial if presented wrong and would sound like the point of the entire argument if presented right. She had thought for 4 days about how to present it, and she had settled on presenting it last, after everything else, as the small detail that contained the large idea. She said, the soldier who removed 41 of our prisoners from a secured facility while sedating our guards non-lethally and orchestrating a 3-team information extraction operation. This same soldier spent 3 minutes at a diplomatic reception reading the ingredient lists on the food, because a colleague of his had a recently changed medication, and he wanted to make sure nothing on the table would interact badly with it. These are not different behaviors from a different kind of person. These are the same behavior from the same person, the same attention, the same care, the same refusal to stop tracking the details of a situation just because the situation is quiet. A species that cannot be persuaded to stop doing this, she said, is not a species we should be planning to contain. The vote was 7-4 in favor of the second argument, which meant the implementation proceeded not as an acknowledgement of defeat, but as a recalibration, which was a different posture entirely. It was not a final settlement of anything. It was, as Kane had said, a starting point. 3 months after the arbitration, a junior cultural exchange program was established between a V3 academic institution and a Terran colonial university. This was Valith's initiative, and it was small, and it received very little attention from the people who tracked such things, because it looked like the kind of diplomatic gesture that meant very little in practice. It meant something in practice because the 2 junior researchers who spent 6 months at the V3 institution came back with the first detailed mapping of V3 administrative decision-making processes that any human institution had ever produced. And because the 3 V3 exchange students who spent a semester at the Terran Colonial University went home with an understanding of human academic culture that could not be acquired from reports, which was that human academic culture was chaotic, argumentative, deeply unglamorous, and ferociously difficult to predict, and that the chaos was not a sign of disorder, but a sign of an organism that was still actively becoming something, rather than maintaining what it already was. One of the 3 V3 exchange students wrote a report about this for the Compact's Intelligence Division. The report was flagged as thoughtful and filed with several others in a category labeled long-term assessment, and not acted on, because long-term assessments rarely were, immediately. But they were filed, and the people who would later read them would read them in a context shaped by what Valith had said to the council, and what the council had done with what she said, and what had led her to say it, which was a cargo container and a man who had been rebuilt 11 times and 4 children following instructions in the dark, while adults made decisions around them, and a creek on New Meridian where the gravity was slightly lighter than Earth standard. Kane got back to New Meridian 6 weeks after the signing ceremony. He got back because Yusra Obi had told her brother that the person who had come to get them had mentioned the creek, and the way the light fell on it in the morning, and her brother, whose name was actually Daniel, which was close enough to Marcus that the confusion at the holding facility made more sense in retrospect, had written to the Colonial Defense Forces liaison office asking if they could pass a message to the corporal who had led the extraction, because Yusra wanted to say thank you. The liaison office had passed the message to Ewan. Ewan had passed it to Kane with a handwritten note that said, "You have time, go." Kane went. The creek was there. The light on it in the morning was, as he had assessed from the site surveys, the kind of light that came from a slightly different stellar spectral profile than Earth's sun, which made shadows fall at an angle that you noticed without being able to say why you noticed it. The creek itself was cleaner than the water filtration records had suggested it would be. Yusra had done something additional when she reconnected the system, an upgrade she had been planning before the integration attempt interrupted her, and the water quality now exceeded the colonial standard. He stood at the edge of the creek for a while. A child appeared from the direction of one of the residential clusters. Not one of the 4 from the station, a different child, younger, maybe 6 years old, wearing the kind of outfit that a 6-year-old assembles from whatever is available when adults are not paying close enough attention. The child looked at him with the frank assessment that very young children applied to unknown adults. "Are you the soldier?" the child said. "Yes," he said. "My mom said you came and got everyone." "I had help." The child considered this. Do you want to see the frogs? He looked at the creek. There are frogs. Yeah, they're not like earth frogs. They have more legs. The child said this with the proprietary authority of someone reporting on something they had discovered personally. You have to be quiet or they hide. Cain crouched down to the child's height, which brought him to creek level. Show me, he said. They were quiet, the two of them, at the edge of the creek in the angled morning light of New Meridian. And the frogs, which did have more legs than earth frogs and which were colored a peculiar shade that the colonists had not yet formally named, came out from under the bank in the particular cautious way of small things that had decided, provisionally, that the environment was safe. Cain watched them. He thought about 11 times rebuilt. He thought about cargo containers and allergen lists and a 7-4 vote in an alien council chamber. He thought, we're still here. The frogs moved in the water, quiet and alive, in the lighter-than-earth gravity of a planet that humans had decided, provisionally, was worth staying on. He thought, we keep being still here. The child next to him held very still, which was impressive for a 6-year-old, and watched the frogs with the absolute attention of someone for whom this was, genuinely, one of the most interesting things in the world. Cain held still too. He was good at that.